So it's time to switch to English. It is really, really a great honor to today be welcoming the British ecological economist, professor of sustainable development, Tim Jackson. Please come up. He's at the University of Surrey. You're also the director of CUSP. But I also want to say that foremost, and that is why it's also such an honor to me, who have been hugely inspired. I mean, Tim is a world-renowned author and economist when it comes to challenging the concept of growth and degrowth. But you are now here to talk about your latest book, The Care Economy, where I will say that you again challenge conventional economic thinking. Wonderful. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
And
Thank
here's
you.
your...
the clicker, and it works?
It works.
I see my slides.
And
yeah, fantastic.
the green,
good,
big green
the
arrow.
big green button, just in case I get lost.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It's thank you for inviting me. Thank you for letting me in. I don't know if you know this, but there is a new protocol to allow people from outside the EU, outside the Schengen area, into the Schengen area. And so far, Sweden is the first and only country to have implemented this new protocol. So I was delighted to experience it for the first time as I came in through the airport yesterday. It looked as though it was going to be a really dark experience for me, and it turned into something wonderful, which is why I want to tell you this story. Because first of all, I had an app which didn't work, which I was supposed to do before I got there. And at the last minute, it did actually say that I had been allowed to proceed to the special place where if you've done this pre-registration, you can get a shorter queue. The shorter queue didn't move for half an hour. And eventually somebody took pity on me and they told me to go into the crew lane. So I went into the crew lane, and somebody, when I got to the desk, says, "What are you doing in this lane? You're not supposed to be here." And welcome to Sweden. and I explained that I'd been told to go there and sort of got away with it. And then there was this very surly exchange about what I was doing here and why I was coming and how long I was coming for and all this kind of thing. And what is it exactly you're doing? I'm doing a conference. Which conference is it? It's Mistra Sustainable Consumption. And this nameless, faceless person on the other side of the glass actually looked at me like a human being and smiled. and then we went on with, can you show me your ticket, please, to make sure that you're leaving? And she got to the and taking all my biometrics, which fingers I had to put on which bits of which glass to be recorded properly. I am now properly recorded. I am legitimately here in Sweden. And at the end of it all, thank you. I first came here 35 years ago, and it was like walking into our home country. I was working for the Stockholm Environment Institute, which at that point was in Gamla Stan, just across the water there. And it is really wonderful to come home in that sort of intellectual sense to the beginning of this journey that led me to the care economy. But I just want to finish the story with this encounter yesterday. Because when we got to the end of it all, and she'd satisfied herself that I was a legitimate visitor to Sweden, she said to me, "So, sustainable consumption, huh? That's less consumption?" So, no, I didn't want to go into a 20-year battle between consuming less and consuming differently. And I thought that might push my luck. So I sort of said, "Yes, exactly." And she said, "Good luck with that." So, good luck with that. I mean, I have to say, when I first came here, the sustainable consumption meetings did not fill a room this size, so it is definitely progress of a kind. And the work that I was doing at SEI led, as many of you will know, to this publication, Prosperity Without Growth, which was, at some point, also translated into Sweden. There you are. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce välfärd utan tillväxt. I did okay? Fantastic. First test passed. But out of that work came definitely for me this idea of asking ourselves what prosperity is. And prosperity, traditionally thought of as income, as wealth, what actually is it that matters most to people? And it becomes very clear when you ask the question in that way that prosperity actually is much better thought of as health rather than as wealth. And the evidence for that if you don't have your health, you don't have anything else. The first wealth is health. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson from 1860s. There is no wealth but life, John Ruskin from a little bit earlier. I went looking for wealth and I found it was my health. Rumi is alleged to have said several centuries before that. So in the wisdom of the ages, the idea that prosperity is more about health than it is about wealth is a really powerful one. And actually in the interim, we've done a lot of work just asking people what their priorities are in life. Prosperity means prosperes, in accordance with our hopes and expectations. What is it that we aspire to? What is the good life? And first and foremost, when you just ask people, that's the kind of answer that you get, that it's about health. And it was from that idea, which, as I say, was seeded way back when I was working at SEI and just afterwards with Prosperity Without Growth, that if that's what prosperity is about, then what should the economy be doing? And obviously, that idea leads you on to the idea that the economy should be something about care. And I use the word care here, and this is a very useful definition from Joan Tronto and Berenice Fisher: care as an activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. So it's not just kind of care as in social care or care for your kids. Those things are definitely included. It's care for material things. It's care for planet. It's care for community. It's that process of making the world and keeping the world livable so that we can achieve this prosperity, this health, this well-being that is the object of the economy. Now, when you put it in those terms, it seems so blindingly obvious that there's nothing much to it, except for the also blindingly obvious question: why doesn't the blindingly obvious actually happen? Why is that not what our economy is doing? But I want, and I'm coming on to that, I want to spend a little bit of time on that. But I want to show you also, I want to talk to you about how, in some sense, sustainable consumption can be seen as the care economy. And when we think about sustainable consumption, when we think about consuming differently or consuming less, we often think about improving the material efficiency of supply chains. We often think about choosing different consumer products and services. We think about shifting from products to services is another way of looking at the sustainable consumption problem, challenge. And of course, we also do think about consuming less, particularly less material stuff, that attack on a consumerism that simply is almost stealing our humanity by suggesting that all of our needs are material needs and all of those needs can be satisfied with consumer products. That's a challenge that sustainable consumption has brought to modern society. And it has done so also by questioning the environmental impacts of our consumption and speaking to the question of the limits of a finite world in which consumption simply grows forever. I want to just show you here a little bit how that train of thought, which you're all very familiar with, of course, can lead us towards thinking about the economy as the care economy. And I want to do it with this. I'm going to show you a little bit of data, not too much, but I want, and if you need to look at the slides again later, because I'll go through quite quickly. I'm sure they'll be available. But this is a set of axes, which has on the vertical axis the carbon intensity of different aspects of what economists call final demand, what consumers want. So this is the carbon intensity. And then the horizontal axis is the number of people employed in creating the products to satisfy, products and services that satisfy that final demand. So it's employment along the bottom, carbon on the left-hand axis, on the vertical axis. And what I've tried to do here, and my team at CUSP has tried to do, is to map what the economy looks like in terms of final demand against these two axes. And you find a very distinct pattern. This is for the EU. So here, for example, right at the top, you've got manufactured goods, which are, not surprisingly, very carbon intensive. Food products also quite carbon intensive. Construction, transport, distribution, those types of things tend to be quite carbon intensive. A little bit middling in terms of the employment intensity. Here on the left-hand side, you've got a big bubble called tech and finance, which interestingly employs virtually no one and claims not to be emitting very much in terms of carbon. Now, that's not going to stay like that with the amount of energy that's being consumed by data farms to provide AI. But at the moment, it has a relatively clean-ish profile, even if it's not contributing much to the employment in the economy. And then this is where I want to point you towards these activities on the right-hand side of the graph, where you have health, education, social care, arts, recreation, other services, hospitality, a set of activities that is really about quality of life, that's about health, that's about well-being, that's about ensuring that we have the prospect to live well, to live in accordance with our hopes and expectations. Similar pattern if you take the OECD as a whole, actually slightly clearer, that you have this green cluster of activities. And broadly speaking, and again this idea goes right back to prosperity without growth, where I began to think about this right-hand bottom side of the diagram as a kind of Cinderella economy, an economy left behind by all the people rushing towards tech and finance and manufacturing stuff. And now I think is better even described as a kind of a care economy. So this, if you like, is a way of thinking about sustainable consumption in terms of that shift towards a structure of the economy that dedicates itself to activities that improve our health and our well-being, the care economy. And of course, we can also introduce into that same diagram another central idea from sustainable consumption, which is that you should be doing things better. Some of this manufactured goods, maybe, if you reduce the carbon intensity, maybe you might even introduce a little bit of repairability that would increase employment. You would shift that sector also into something which could still legitimately be called the care economy, an economy of repair, maintain, continue, and repair our world. And of course, equally with food products, which I want to come on to in a minute, because a lot of attention's been given in sustainable consumption debates to food. And that strategy of actually kind of bringing food within the care economy is equally an important one. Now, what is not to like about this economy, really? It's got low carbon, potentially even negative carbon if you include some kinds of activities. It's got high employment, so we could live well. And it's a set of activities that actually contributes directly to our quality of life, to our well-being, to our health. Prosperity as health, economy as care. So that, in a nutshell, is the foundation for the idea in the care economy. It's a progression from prosperity without growth, but it's one which appeals to the idea, in fact, that prosperity is something that matters to us, and it matters most to us in terms of our well-being and our health, and it points the direction of the economy towards a different place, economy as care, rather, perhaps, than as growth. It also raises that question, why does that blindingly obvious equation not actually hold in the economy? Why is our economy so careless? And I want to talk about this. I want to first show you, I guess, how careless the economy is by reference, first of all, to that sector, which we quite often spend a lot of time and attention on, food. And the careless economy really is no better illustrated than these two graphs to me. These graphs show growth rates that conventional economists and politicians would absolutely love. On the blue ones, blue teal colored ones on the left-hand side, 7.6, 8.4, 6.6, growth rates that are contributing to the economy. GDP, GVA. What are they? I'll tell you. Breads and cereals, sweets and snacks, oils and fats, ready meals, ultra-processed food. Not exactly the recipe for a healthy economy, not exactly the recipe for prosperity as health. But it doesn't really matter, because over here, what we have is another set of growth rates, 5%, 6%, a massive 12% there. What are these? Painkillers for the inflammation that's caused by eating all this stuff. Statins for the bringing down of the blood pressure that's caused by this stuff and the cholesterol. Proton pump inhibitors, because you've got indigestion from eating all this stuff. metformin because your blood sugar has gone too high, and finally, the massive one here, anti-obesity drugs. So this is not a careful economy. This is not an economy contributing to the care and the health of our society. It is actually a recipe for a population health disaster. And yet both of these industries are beloved by government. You will find prime ministers on platforms with the CEOs of big pharma companies proclaiming that their country is open for investment, and they are welcoming this pharma country in for a massive trial of anti-obesity drugs whose long-term impacts are unknown, whose effectiveness is not particularly successful. Most people come off those drugs after a year, half come off after a year, 85% come off those drugs after 2 years, and when you come off the drugs, you actually gain weight faster than before you were on the drugs. And the long-term effects of that are horrendous. But the big side effect of it is a profoundly economic one. We are spending, this is the UK, £268 billion every year on the indirect and direct health, food-related health costs of the dysfunctional food system that we are living inside. That's bigger than the bill for the National Health Service. It is also 3 times almost what people are spending on food. And it is 4 times what it would cost for the government to subsidize healthy food and allow everyone to eat healthy, accessible, sustainable food from decent farming and production processes, which would also, potentially pay people and employ people as well. So what you have here, and I called it essentially the false economy. You can find these graphs in a report that I did for the Food Farming Countryside Commission last year. And I call it a false economy for a very obvious reason. In pursuit of growth, in pursuit of the things that promise to give us growth, in politically supporting all those things that promise to give us growth, we're creating a public health disaster of massive proportions, which is generating unpayable costs to the public purse. As we speak, right now, at this very minute, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor in the UK, is getting up in front of Parliament, fighting for her political life in a budget where she has to find 25 or 30 billion pounds to prove that she's credible. 10 times that is being wasted by failing to solve the problem of public health that underlies a dysfunctional food system. These are arguments that should and could go into Treasury. They're arguments that should sway political opinion. They're arguments that behind which there is an increasing public support. And they're arguments, I think, which could also win votes for politicians. Why does this still continue to happen? Now, there are various reasons, I think. You can talk about the politics of power. You can talk about the structural issues. I want to start with this one. Why is economics so careless? Because actually care is a gendered concept. And you don't probably in this room need me to point that out to you at all. But 70% of what we traditionally call care work is carried out by women across the world. Most of it is underpaid or unpaid. Care itself is devalued. Care workers are denigrated. There was one moment during the pandemic when we stood on our balconies and applauded the care workers. That moment swiftly disappeared in the aftermath when inflation was raging and nurses, for example, in my country were looking for a wage increase that would at least allow them to live, or would at least bring their pay somewhere up to covering inflation, even though in the end they settled for something much, much less than that. And the political answer to that is we can't afford to do it. That answer is, has some realism associated, but not in the context of those economics that we were looking at before, not in the context of that false economy. And I want to come on to what we can do about it to redress that towards the end. But that first issue, and that care is gendered, that care is somehow feminine, that it's female, and that female is less worth than male, and that we live still in, despite you know, the lyrics of some Taylor Swift songs, we live in a society which is basically still patriarchal, and that is embedded in our values in society. And that gender gap actually is quite profound. Even last year, the World Economic Forum predicted that on current progress, they have a measure of the gender gap, which includes health, education, political empowerment, and economic status. And they concluded that across those four measures, it'll take approximately 134 years to reach global parity across gender. So that idea that gender matters is still very much at the forefront of why things are going wrong. I didn't see, I should have looked to see where Sweden sits on this. I just took this graphic, but I think probably in Sweden, you're not quite where the United States is, for example, on gender parity. But at the global level, 134 years towards gender parity is an extraordinary indictment of a society that still in its institutional core is profoundly patriarchal. And that patriarchal, I'm not suggesting, and this is a really tricky thing, because obviously I'm a man here standing that, and then almost half the audience is also men, and I'm definitely not trying to create or claim some moral high ground by pointing this out. What I am trying to do is to sort of say that this patriarchy matters because it's embedded in institutions and structures, and those structures still profoundly affect the way that our economy makes decisions. And that's what I want to come on to next, really. The picture here, by the way, is Florence Nightingale, who's seen quite often as this, you know, perfect, well-intentioned do-gooder who managed to create nursing out of the horrors of the Crimean War back in 1850s, 1860s. Actually, she was a very hard-nosed woman with some incredibly powerful ideas, but she's not often given the credit for that. And she does illustrate, I think, that aspect of care as being profoundly gendered. But let me talk about where that comes out. Where do those patriarchal values actually live in our capitalistic society? They live in something which is a profound disjunct within capitalism. Care takes time. You have to know what the needs are. You have to pay attention to those needs. Even the act of paying attention is time intensive. You have to engage with those needs. Those needs occur at a personal level, social level. That process of social interaction is time consuming. In capitalism, time is money. Time is what you want to get out of the production process. It's called labor productivity. Economists love the pursuit of labor productivity. It's the foundation for growth. And so we're constantly selecting in those activities where we can select out time from the equation. So mass production, replace people with robots. Mass thinking, replace our minds with AI. The processes that can create short-lived products that we can throw away tomorrow and then desire more of the next day can all be produced through a system of mass production that reduces working time in the equation and creates an incentive, actually, a motivation to continue to grow the economy. Because if you're pushing people out of work all the time, you're going to have a mass unemployment problem unless you can grow the economy itself. So you've created within capitalism this dynamic, and you've done it by creating an equation between time and money. I just need to go back, I think, to that that slide. And that lives inside capitalism. That conflict between care and capital plays itself out through the way that time is treated in the equation, in the institutions, in the regulations, in the motivations, in the pursuit of profit. And it lives inside it so structurally. And an economist called William Baumol pointed this out in the 1960s. It lives inside it so structurally that these activities, what I've called the care economy, health, education, social care, the things that take time, continually find themselves to be second or third class citizens in the economy. It's not just accidental. It's not just value. It's value embodied in institutions and structures that systematically select out the care economy and select in the careless economy. If we don't recognize that, if we don't see where the problem is, we're not going to be able to get beyond it. But I want, finally, before we have a little bit of a discussion, I want to just make another point, which I talk about in the book, which is And it goes back to what I was saying before, about the moral high ground and, kind of claiming something as a man, which women have talked about for a very long time. And I do justice to that conversation in the book, that care has become a morally laden concept. Care in our language, almost certainly in English, is seen as being almost morally unassailable. Like if you admit to not caring, then you admit to being somehow less than human. If you claim to care, then you're claiming that moral high ground. Now, to me, that's interesting, but it's also problematic, partly because it divides us between those who say they care and those who say they don't care, or those who say they are allowed to care and those who have care forced out of them. And a philosopher psychologist called Carol Gilligan pointed out very early on how this moral aspect of care becomes gendered very early on in development. So little girls are essentially kind of cultured into care, and little boys are cultured out of it very, very early on. And in the same token, those little boys who are being cultured out of care are being cultured into violence. And violence, to some extent, is the absolute antithesis of care. It's the opposite of care. It's the thing that continually brings us into challenge, care and violence. And there's another feminist author called Kathleen Lynch, in a book called Care and Capitalism, makes this point that you can't really hope to understand care until you understand violence. I don't want to go into that point too deeply now. Maybe we can get to it later. Because what I want to point out about this aspect of care as being morally unassailable is that it's not helpful, particularly. What would be helpful would be to go back to the question and ask what actually functionally is care. What can we legitimately call care? And what are its dynamics? And the most important way into that is to go back and ask the question, what is health? And here is an idea of what health is. It is very, very rarely just about growth. It is much more often, in fact, almost uniquely, about balance. This was a book, The Wisdom of the Body, was written in 1932 by Walter Cannon, and it was the book where he coined the term homeostasis, that process through which we maintain the integrity of the conditions of life within our bodies. And it's going on all the time. Constant attention, care to the conditions of the body. What's happening? How excited am I? How bored am I? How fast do I have to move? How cold is it? How much does my heart have to pump? Where's my blood glucose? Where's the level of that blood glucose? All of these things regulated absolutely continually in every single living organism by a process which we could legitimately call care, restoring balance. The process of care as the restoration of balance. And as Walter Cannon pointed out in 1932, might it not be useful to look at other forms of organization and say, where does care live? Where is health? Where is balance? How do you get back to balance? And that's a process which I talk about quite a lot in the book. The picture of the moon there is a kind of a metaphor. You wouldn't think normally about the moon exercising care, but there are aspects of the moon which do mimic care. It's constantly there. It's constantly at attention. It's constantly providing a balance. That balance regulates the tides, for example. It's done it for millennia. And in the old days, that range between the sea coming in and the sea going out was where our ancestors crawled out of the sea onto the earth. In other words, we wouldn't be here but for the careful attention of this satellite to our own unique planetary system. So what I'm pointing at, I guess, is the idea that we can think of care not as a moral high ground, not as a particular sector of the economy, but actually as a fundamental operating principle for organic life. And that takes us, I think, to the question of how we then begin to integrate this into our economics, into our policy. What should we do about it? There's a wonderful quote which I talk about in the book. The question, what should we do about it, is only ever asked when we don't understand the problem. This was a philosopher called Alan Watts talking in the 1950s, and I really wish throughout my career I had had it to hand when I had engagements with policy and politicians who want to know what to do about it. What to do on Monday is the common question. How do we change things on Monday? So this idea that the first step towards knowing what to do is to understand, I think, is a very powerful one. But that powerful step has taken us to this realization that care is essentially a principle, the fundamental organizing principle of organic life, one that we neglect at our peril. The nature of that principle is restorative, restoring the balance that leads us to health, prosperity. It is also, care is also, if you think about that balance, that aim of prosperity as health, then health becomes our most important, our most precious asset. And that makes care an investment. That's a really interesting conclusion to come to, because investments are treated in bookkeeping terms differently than everyday expenditure. If you think care is all about your everyday budget, then you have to fiscally be responsible for it in a very different way than if you think about it as an investment, which ultimately it is in health as an asset. So it gives those people sitting inside Treasury, those people sitting inside statistics offices, those people looking at how to remedy this, an avenue to place resources in the place that you need them in order to improve health. It is also, because we have not done this, it is a massive unpaid debt. So care has been exercised outside the market for free under terrible conditions for a long, long time because of the division of labor imposed on the economy by capitalism. And that is something that obviously has to be repaired if you want to value care properly in society. Now, here's a fascinating one. You know, all of these things seem a little bit punitive or a little bit at the level of rules, regulations, and policies. What if we think about care in society in the same way that care is exercised within the body? Homeostasis in the body, the constant regulation of our dopamine, of our blood sugar, of our heart rate, of our breathing rate in the body. This allows us as an organism the freedom to move about. Those organisms who don't have that homeostatic ability are basically static. They're stagnant. They don't move. They don't have the ability to do things. They don't have the ability to go out into the world. They don't have the ability to have the experiences that an organism like the human being can have by having a homeostatic system which allows it to go into sub-freezing temperatures and still survive. And that is a really interesting way to open our minds to the idea that care is not a prison in which we have to confine ourselves, but the very basis for the freedom to think about what it actually means to be human and to make a kind of progress towards a kind of prosperity that is deeper, more resonant, more humane, and ultimately more sustainable than prosperity as wealth, namely prosperity as health. It's a kind of red pill for thinking about how to escape from the matrix, which we too often think of ourselves as captured in and expressed so eloquently by my new friend at customs yesterday. Good luck with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
For
Erika.
mapping that out. I would like to dive a little deeper into some of the things you said. In your book, The Care Economy, as you mentioned, you write that my assignment is not so much to point out the blindingly obvious as to ask why the blindingly obvious doesn't happen. So I'm just sort of wondering, what are the biggest obstacles?
Yeah, I suppose they're the ones that I was pointing. There are lots of different obstacles, but I think I think that those three things that I was pointing to, a value system which devalues something which is seen to be feminine, female, rather than masculine, male. That happens at a level that it isn't simply about a kind of soft, fluffy conversational level about values. It's actually hardwired into our institutions. And that some of that is structural within capitalism. So this dynamic that I was talking about, this Baumol had something which he called the cost disease. And it's a disease that he argued that these kinds of sectors, consistently face within capitalism, because they are caught in a spiral of rising costs and low productivity. Now, if you're making stuff, the rising costs, you can get them out of the way. If wage costs rise, for example, you can get them out of the way by hiring fewer people and making them work faster. So higher productivity can get you out of that disease if you're living in certain kinds of sectors which just mass produce stuff. If you're working in these sectors which are employment intensive, which take time, which revolve around care and attention, that productivity gain is not available to you without undermining the product. And so you consistently end up with rising prices in society, which you can't simply export by increasing productivity. And when you do try to increase productivity within those sectors beyond a certain point, you're asking your nurses to see more and more patients every hour, your doctors to see more and more patients, your teachers to teach bigger and bigger classes, your musicians to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony faster and faster. You are asking for things which undermine the quality of that sector.
But you were also showing very eloquently the costs. I mean, there were some really completely bizarre effects. As you said, we eat all that and we go on anti-obesity medicine, statins, all of this. So, and then you said, the care economy, what's really not to like about it?
Yeah.
But I am thinking that there are other people out there seeing also those costs. But I still would like to ask again, if you're more concrete, is it big pharma?
Big pharma is definitely implicated. Big food is implicated. We've just
agribusiness.
Agribusiness.
How? In what way are you seeing this?
Well, let me tell you a little story. A little while ago, there was an event earlier this year, in the Houses of Parliament to celebrate 60 years of KFC in the UK, and it was hosted by a Labour politician, and a Tory politician who attended had a big media campaign afterwards saying how much she had a clucking good time. And that's, cross-party consensus is a hard thing to get, particularly in the UK at the moment. And yet somehow KFC had managed to engineer cross-party consensus for political support for a food sector, which is not single-handedly by any means, but deeply implicated in unhealthy eating. And PepsiCo has done the same thing. McDonald's was there last year. You can see that political power operating through the machinery of government to protect the conditions to continue to operate. And their argument is, we contribute to growth, we contribute to GVA, we contribute to jobs. Mess with us at your peril. And that argument at the moment is winning, partly because the sort of analysis that I was showing is not in Treasury. It's not being done in Statistics Office. It's not even known by many of the public. And so that process of power, it is a process of power. I would accept that argument.
Yes, but you're also challenging huge financial interests.
Yeah.
Some of the biggest industries in the world.
Yeah. Good luck with that.
Right. Well, but I thought we should. Several of your groundbreaking books, Prosperity Without Growth, you do argue that economic growth is incompatible with ecological stability, that we need an economy that favors prosperity and ecological limits. But how can you adjust this and still remain within the limits of the liberal democracy? Because it seems to me that your message is deeply radical if you really look at what you're saying. How are you ever going to how are those economic forces ever voluntarily going to give up their grip?
Yeah. It's a useful question. Radical is an interesting word. I like the word radical. It comes from the roots of the word radical lie in the word roots. So, a radical position is one that looks at the roots of where we are and uproots the things that are not working and roots the things that we need in order to work them properly. And I do accept that that's a huge challenge, and I don't have any answers to it after 35 years of coming up with radical solutions. But what I do see, even with greater clarity, I see more people in the room. That's a start. That is a very good start. But I also see with greater clarity that if we fail to address these problems, what do we have? We have a planet that is destroyed, we have a public health disaster, we have a fiscal situation that is completely unsustainable as governments constantly run after the ever increasing costs of a system trying to solve the problem of chronic disease generated by a dysfunctional food system by adding in the pharmaceutical mixture, just as an example, over and over again in the name of growth. And so I do come back really in that sense to prosperity without growth, that it's not against growth itself, it's against a fixation with growth that's preventing us seeing this blindingly obvious and allowing our politicians to listen to the loudest voices in their ear, who are people with a lot of power, to actually engineer our own neuropsychology to make us feel that we're addicted to the foods that are going to destroy our health. That is a disaster waiting to happen in anybody's terms. And so I don't know that even in spite of having more people in the room and some places where the arguments are listened to more, I don't know that I can say I'm massively optimistic that we're on the cusp of something that has changed. But what I can say with absolute certainty is that not addressing it, not changing it, not understanding it is driving us towards disaster.
So I would like to zoom out a bit and sort of look globally, because it is a very sort of saying phrase that, we need health without wealth. But I have done a lot of traveling and reporting in third world countries, and all they talk about is growth.
Yep.
I mean, I was, for instance, I did a story in Malawi of a women's clinic, and I can say that my dog here in Stockholm got 100 times better and safer care
Yep.
that those women were getting. So something that I thought about reading your book does, and this is maybe a loaded question, but are you thinking more about rich post-industrial societies in this, or is that a fair description?
Well, I am thinking, Prosperity Without Growth was written for the UK government. I did not expect what happened on the back of that report to the Prime Minister in the UK in 2009 to happen. I did not expect those ideas to have a global audience. I thought maybe they'll be picked up somewhere in Europe, somewhere in the United States. The opposite actually happened, is that some of those arguments had more resonance in the places where I would least expect them to have.
It was translated in
resonance.
how many languages?
It's translated in over 20 languages, and they're not by any means all European languages. And the interest reflected even beyond those translations. I did a day seminar with people in Malaysia who wanted to construct a 100-year plan for the Malaysian economy. I mean, nobody here thinks in terms of 100-year plans, but apparently economists in Malaysia were doing that. So I spent a day on Skype, as it was in those days, with them, talking it through. And I did not want to be an ambassador for yet another economic model coming from a white Anglo-Saxon background, which is the best thing that could possibly happen to the rest of the world. I resisted that idea furiously, but what I did find was those people were able to engage in that conversation as profoundly and sometimes more profoundly than people that I had written the report for in my own government. That said, your point about, wealth in developing countries, and I usually have the slide in the slide deck, and it's very early on in Prosperity Without Growth. The relationship between life expectancy and income per capita is a profoundly interesting one. Life expectancy practically doubles when you go from having nothing in sub-Saharan Africa to having around $10,000 per capita in Latin America. Life expectancy, a primary measure of health, doubles during that period. And then the strange thing happens, which is that tails off. Your life expectancy actually is worse in countries like USA, UK, Ireland than it is in Cuba, Costa Rica, and Chile, which is a paradox for a world that thinks prosperity is about wealth, and it will continually, having higher incomes will continually give us better prosperity outcomes. It is true up to a point. And so your example about Malawi is absolutely critical. If you can provide healthcare in Malawi, and if you can improve incomes at the rural level in Malawi, you can have magnificent outcomes in terms of health. But it's kind of like prosperity as wealth is half a model. Prosperity as income is a half as model. Having more is better when you do not even remotely have enough. And then after a certain point, actually, when you have more of the population dying from diseases of overconsumption than from malnutrition, which is the case according to the World Health Organization, then you realize that you've passed some critical point, but you have no means of stopping because everything is geared still towards more.
So you were on the Sustainability Commission that also dealt with climate issues, correct? I was in the UK this weekend, and the new political rock star of the UK is Zach Polanski, the new leader of the Green Party, who to me sounded very much like a traditional leftist politician, but he was clearly putting people first.
Yeah.
And I am wondering a little bit about your own journey. I mean, I know you're still concerned about the planet and all that, but is this sort of shifting focus looking more at how people will benefit from a planet imbalance rather than the old narrative, maybe, to only talk about climate?
Yeah, I think you can possibly think about it in that way. I mean, it emerged from an ecological concern. When I was working at Stockholm Environment Institute, I was working on climate change. I was working on waste, on material streams. I wrote a volume which was about the new thinking at that time in terms of preventive environmental management. Don't create the problems in the first place, and then you don't have to clean them up afterwards. That line of thinking led me actually to this questioning of the growth-based model, which drives material consumption, and out of that came prosperity without growth, which was founded around that idea that if you have ecological limits, you have to live within them. That process still has to be articulated in terms of what that means for people's lives, what that means for their motivations, what that means for their ambitions, their aspirations, their prosperity. And in some sense, the care economy emerges from that. And it does speak a different language than the language of limits and the language of ecological concerns. And in so doing, I think it does have some potential to draw in a bigger audience. And I think that's politically, that's absolutely necessary. You need to bring people in to those discussions. But it doesn't neglect the idea of ecological limits.
Has that been lacking, speaking about people's well-being?
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, the just transitions, sustainable consumption and just transitions now is language that's very much pulled together. And the idea of just transitions did begin to articulate some of those concerns that people were kind of being left out of the discussion and were actually being disadvantaged by some of the things that were going on. And even if they didn't actually, in fact, do that, that possibility was weaponized by our politicians to such an extent that it became sustainable consumption, planetary boundaries, climate change, net zero became an agenda for an elite political minority who was trying to cling on to their own advantages. That's their characterization. It's not mine, of course, but it's a very, very dangerous characterization, and it is totally weaponized and manipulated by power interests who are creating the false economy through food, through pharma, through manufacturing, through tech that's destroying the mental health of our children, through AI that's destroying our own creativity, in pursuit of this holy grail that politicians continually come back to: growth, growth, growth. And we have to, that is the sense in which I think this has to be a kind of red pill exercise. Do you want to stay in the matrix, or do you want to actually face reality? And if you want to face reality, then you have to understand how these dynamics are bringing us further and further, closer and closer towards destruction of public health, destruction of climate, destruction of the oceans, destruction of the soils, destruction of the basis on which we grow the food that we need to survive. Ultimately, those two things are not in conflict.
But my brother just put solar panels on his house.
Yeah.
So he bought solar panels.
Yeah.
That is adding to growth and GDP. Is that okay?
Well, if it's substitute, it depends. It may be adding to GDP. It's certainly contributing to the economy. Whether it increases GDP marginally depends incrementally, as an economist, on what happens to the fossil fuels he's displacing. If he increases his demand for electricity as a result of having those panels, then likely, yes, it's going to increase GDP, and there will be certain limitations to that as a strategy. But in the meantime, I would put PVs on my roof if I had the right direction.
But that is growth.
It's not growth in itself, it is economic activity. I'm not arguing for an economy without economic activity.
But that's an interesting distinction. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, so what is growth? Growth is growth in the GDP, a bigger GDP next year than this year. And that depends on what we spend and what we invest in. So if we invest in some photovoltaics and nothing else in the economy changes, and those photovoltaics are sitting on your brother's roof, that's an increase in GDP, so that's growth. But if they're actually not displacing It only holds if they're not displacing any fossil fuels, if he continues to just have them sitting on his roof, having paid for them. Once he's paid for them, he's going to use them, isn't he? I mean, he's going to use them to generate electricity, and that means he's not generating electricity through fossil fuels, and that means there's less output in the fossil fuel industry. And so, in principle, at least, just from that one example of your brother's PVs, growth doesn't necessarily have to move at all. The economy is still the same size. He's still doing the same things. If he's like most PV owners, he will start doing things much more efficiently, using less electricity, and that means that actually growth has a chance to go down, and also, obviously, to have much less impact. So it's quite a complicated question, but I mean, a lot of people have made the argument, if you massively invest in renewables at this point in time, you will have a blip in growth. And that is possible that might happen in the short term.
Right.
But in the long term, if that does happen in the long term, then we're back where we started and we haven't solved the problem of climate limits.
So we're here today, just to finish off now, to explore the issue of sustainable consumption. And I had 2 examples. I just wanted to hear your... So ultra-processed food are making people sick. We heard that. In Sweden, we're importing more and more processed potato, chips, French fries, etc. It's going up almost to the half of the consumption. Sweden is, again, a perfect country to grow potatoes. It's called the champagne of potatoes up in the north because we have so much light. But now we have potato farms closing down. So how would you, as an economist, sort of address that kind of, I don't know what to call it, imbalance, which is obviously not going towards what you want with the care economy?
Well, that's quite a complicated question. It starts with how many potatoes you should be eating. Can I just praise and maybe a round of applause for the amazing lunch that was put on today, because because the balance of that lunch was extraordinary. That lots of fiber, not too much processed anything actually, all very well put together. And I understand healthy, although I'm looking forward to mine afterwards because I thought my digestion might suffer from eating it first. But there is a question there of how much. It isn't. Lots of questions implicit in what. So how much of which kinds of foodstuff should we be eating? We typically eat too many carbohydrates. We typically eat too many refined carbohydrates. We rarely eat enough fiber. We probably mostly eat too many meat and dairy products for our own health, let alone for the environment. So there are really interesting questions around what we should be eating there. But let's accept that potatoes, particularly if you don't peel them and you don't roast them and don't fill them with saturated fat, are a reasonably good part of your diet, and you would want that to be a part of the Swedish diet, and you have the capacity to do it. Why would you not support that industry? Why would you not support those farmers? Why would you actually increase your public health risk by importing processed potatoes from far away, from which fiber has probably been stripped out and the nutritional quantity is less?
Could you give an example? Because you speak of perverse financial subsidies.
Yeah.
So what would your conclusion be?
My conclusion is that it's nuts to do that. It's absolutely crazy to do that. But the work that I did for the Food Farming Countryside Commission was the same thing. The food system and the food chain itself is profoundly dysfunctional in exactly those kinds of ways. The farmers who are producing wholesome food locally in the environment cannot afford to live. We did a tour of the UK when we were doing this work a couple of years ago, and we found people in the food supply chain who had to go to food banks in order to have enough food to eat because their wages were so low, because the returns were so low. And yet at the same time, we can subsidize and incentivize companies to import ultra-processed foods into the country, which are replacing that decent, wholesome, healthy, sustainable food that you can grow here in the name of growth. That is ultimately a political failure. It's a massive political failure.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I had many more questions, but we have... I had many more questions, of course. As if you doubted. But we have to move on. Thank you so much.